Thanks. Okay, this is our fifth and kind of final lesson from Deacons. I say kind of because my last time teaching it, next Sunday, Steve Woodman, when he is here, he is going to answer a couple more practical questions, not like a lesson per se. I have no idea. It might be 10 or 15 minutes, might be half an hour, I don't know. But just some questions that I thought, you know what, coming from somebody who's in an established church that already has deacons, it would be helpful for him to kind of answer some of the practical questions. So he and I talked through some things. We were very aligned on this. In fact, we didn't come across anything that we disagree about. So I thought that was a really encouraging conversation that he and I had that you all could benefit from as well. All right, so last time we looked at verse 10, right? They must also be tested first. If they prove blameless, then they can serve as deacons. Then we talked about how our church, looking at the Confession of Faith and the Constitution, bylaws, tells us how to elect them. Now we're going to look at verses 11 to 13. Would someone read verse 11 for us, please?
Wives likewise should be worthy of respect, not slanderers, self-controlled, faithful women.
Okay. That very first word introduces a little bit of controversy for us. It's actually more complicated of a verse than you might think. Who are these wives? In fact, when you look at other translations, like the, I think the ESV maybe? No. The New American Standard. Oh, I crashed it. That's what I get for trying to read the Bible. Persecution. Hopefully it doesn't do the same thing when I try to... Okay, all right. New American Standard says women. I think even the NIV says women as well. Yeah, the women. Yeah. So there's a little bit of controversy about who are these. Should it be translated as the women or women? Should it be translated as wives, like the CSB, ESV, and New King James says? So we have to address this question first. Who are the wives? I think there are 4 different options. And admittedly, this gets a little like slicing your tomato slices so thin that you can just kind of squish them. It's kind of easy to do that here. Number 1, they are deacons who are female. So it's not talking about a separate office. It is saying in your deacons, you're going to have male deacons and female deacons. And then a very similar view is deaconesses, which means that it's a different office than the deacons. So in the church, you have elders, male deacons, and deaconesses, meaning female deacons. You even have the really odd view of female assistants to the male deacons. Not necessarily wives, but just female assistants in general. But the view that I'm going to take is the 4th one, which is wives of male deacons. So let me talk about why I think it should be understood as deacons' wives. But I first need to give a big caveat, clarification. This is not a first-level issue. When it comes to the ordination of women as elders, I would think of that as a second-level issue, that it's pretty clear from Scripture that men are only supposed to be elders. When it comes to churches believing in female deacons, that's a lot more gray. I could recommend to one of you a church that has female deacons. In fact, I grew up, I didn't realize this at the time, but I grew up in a church for several years that had deaconesses. And now that I look back on it, especially with some of the vitriol that I've heard in even conservative circles, that, it's all these the liberal churches that have deaconesses. And church, we were like super conservative, King James using, and we had deaconesses. So I don't think this is a first-level issue. In fact, even some of the earliest writings we have after the New Testament, there's mention of female deacons and deaconesses. Calvin himself supported female deacons of some sort, which is kind of an interesting twist. If you're familiar with the theologians Robert Dabney or B.B. Warfield from the 1800s, their churches also had female deacons. Now, even though I'm not taking the position that this passage is referring to female deacons or deaconesses, I want to fully affirm the Bible's teaching on the Spirit gifting women to minister and serve in the church. So think of John Mark's mother in Acts 12, or Lydia in Acts 16, or Dorcas in Acts 9. The question is not, can women serve in the church? The question is, can women serve in an official office in the church? Can women serve in the church? Absolutely. Can women serve in an official office in the church? I say probably no. So here's some reason why I think it's the fourth position in deacons' wives. So, first of all, if it is a separate office, where'd it go? Right there, verse 11. Really, the only content we have about qualifications for such an office is right there in one verse amid all of this other stuff. So why is this list so short for female deacons when it's so long for the other offices, meaning male deacons and elders? And wait a second, why isn't there any mention here about a female deacon having character and marriage and family qualifications? You think that'd be kind of important, right? An office bearer to have qualifications, character qualifications, and marriage family implications, but there's none of that. Secondly, there's the logical pattern. I mean, think of 1 Timothy. Let me shrink this so you can see a little bit more. We'll go back up to the beginning. You have the pattern of personal qualifications. Okay, the elder must be above, an overseer must be above reproach. Then it goes on to verse 4, household. So you have verses 1, 2, and 3 are personal qualifications, and then familial qualifications is next. So if you follow that same pattern going down to the deacons section, it's basically you got personal in 8 through 10. And then you have the marital and familial in verses 11 and 12. So it's a family aspect. Then you have the third reason of just contextual smoothness. If he's talking about deacons' wives, it's no surprise that he addresses the wife's character. But if he's talking about another office for females, for instance, like females who serve as deacons, why would he jerk back and forth like that? Because the very next verse after the wives one is deacons, meaning male deacons. So it's just too herky-jerky in the context. And then there's the practical reasons. The office of deacon is a very practical office in the church. It's definitely an office in the church of equal importance as an elder, but it's different than that of an elder. Elders have the spiritual authority. The deacons only have authority as it relates to service in the church. They are the designated servers, you could say, of the church. They do so under the oversight of the elders. So deacons are just as important as an office, but even the elders oversee the deacons. Or think of the deacons, meaning the male deacons. They're going to be ministering in the local church. Well, think of Acts 6. Who's the people who are needing help in Acts 6? Who are the people who are needing help in Acts 6?
The widows.
The widows, females, right? So you can bet that the male deacons that they appointed, I'm going to call them deacons even though the noun wasn't used, but the verb was, if you remember. You can bet that the wives of these deacons were helping their husbands in ministering to these ladies. When we look at church history, for instance, women would help with women who were getting baptized because they needed to protect the modesty of the women as they were getting baptized. They would minister to sick women. They would teach new female members of the church the basics of Christianity so that they could preserve the unity of the church. So our stance, according to our bylaws and according to my own view as an elder, is that our church is only to call men as deacons. But the wives of the men must also make sure that they fit the qualifications given here. So I would not be nominating Alex for deacon, for instance, if Allie was doing crazy things that go against what the passage says. I would not be doing that because they have to serve alongside one another in the church. The bottom line question is not whether it's wives or women, but it's that females have a specific purpose in God's church. There are requirements for these women, whoever they may be. I take it as wives. So what are these qualifications? So let's look at the actual wording now. Yes, sir?
I guess I always thought of that verse 11 as something that was injected in the flow of the argument, first for elders and then for deacons, so that those are the characteristics of the wives for elders and deacons. In other words, that
Elders
should be,
and deacons. Yeah. Interesting.
So, proof of God.
Maybe. I mean, it's in the context of deacons, so I would have to hear some more evidence that it might be referring
We
to
won't sidetrack us.
wives of elders as well. All right, so we got worthy of respect, first of all. So we see this just up the passage here in verse 8. Deacons are to be worthy of respect. The same word also is shown up here in verse 4. Same root word. You won't see it in English very clearly, but it's the same Greek root word, meaning worthy of respect. He behaves, this deacon and then elder, behaves in a way that demands respect of elders. He's serious, noble, respectable, dignified, not silly or goofy. We already looked at that. And now the same must apply to the women who are serving alongside their husbands who are deacons. Next, he tells the women, verse 11, to not be slanderers or malicious talkers. Now, this is kind of an interesting thought. Why does he mention this slandering, this malicious talk to women and not to men? Is Paul trying to say that women are especially guilty of sins of the tongue? Maybe. I don't think so, but maybe. Because he says in Titus, Paul says to Titus in his letter in chapter 2, older women are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, nor slaves to excessive drinking. They're to teach what is good. So instead of slandering, they're to teach what is good. So it's not just a deacon's wives thing, it's a older women thing too. But then again, other people are mentioned too. So 1 Timothy 4:12, talking to that famous verse in 1 Timothy 4. Don't let anyone despise your youth, but set an example for the believers in speech. Or Titus 2:8, your message, Titus, is to be sound beyond reproach. So women are just another example of either good or bad examples of character. And so these deacons' wives need to be not slandering others, just like men are not allowed to. Next is self-controlled. Now, self-controlled may refer to her use of alcohol, like in Titus 2, but I think it has a broader application than just alcohol. For instance, when you slide up to verse 2, an overseer, therefore, is to be above reproach, the husband of one wife, self-controlled. So it's a level-headedness that both men and women in the church should have. Next word is faithful in everything. That's a very broad phrase, isn't it? And that's intentional. These wives of the deacons are supposed to be faithful in whatever it is that they're doing. It's a catch-all phrase, whether it's beliefs or theology or just something that she's been delegated to accomplish. She's going to be faithful in doing what she says that she's going to do. She can be trusted with something. If you tell her something that is confidential and that she might help you with as a deacon's wife, she's not going to be like, hey, did you hear about? It's not what a deacon's wife must do. It's not what any Christian must do. So again, the big idea is not whether women can serve as deacons in the church, but whether women can serve as in the church, period. I'm going to say the answer is obviously yes. God has ordained only men to be elders, but it doesn't mean women are subjected or cast out. They serve as a supportive role in the church. All right, questions on verse 11 before we go to verse 12 next.
If you think of the idea of them not being slanderers, I think it's in part because in that marital relationship they're going to have access to information that others in the church wouldn't necessarily be privy to.
Yep.
And so I think there's a higher requirement for them to be conscious of that. And I would tie that back to the elders and the other argument that what they're asking of the wives is consistent for both groups.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, imagine somebody who is in a benevolent need. A church member can't pay his rent, and the deacon and his wife are talking through these things and trying to serve him best and making sure he has food on his table for he and his wife and kids and so forth. And if she goes around, oh, did you hear that Johnny over here has $3,000 in debt? Well, that's not helpful. That's not wise. That's not prudent. Any other questions on verse 11?
Where are we have all these specifics for deacons and elders and so on. Where are the requirements for a pastor?
Pastor?
Yeah.
Well, they are right there up at the top of the passage. If anyone aspires to be an overseer, that's an elder. He must be above reproach, a husband of one wife, self-controlled, sensible, respectable.
So in other words, they're the same.
Yes, the qualifications are almost the same. They still have a high Christian standard that all Christians are supposed to be, with the 1.5 exceptions. Able to teach. Deacons don't have to be able to teach, but elders have to be able to teach. A normal Christian doesn't have to be able to teach. And an elder can't be a new convert, and the specification is not given for a deacon to be a new convert. But obviously we want new converts in our church, so we're glad to have those in our church. But elders, those are the only 2 exceptions that elders are held to a higher standard than deacons or just normal Christians in the church.
So then this also applies to, when they talk about the women, that also applies then to the pastor's wife.
Yes, because she's called to be a Christian and to have utmost character like anyone else should have. Now, Peter would argue that that verse applies to pastors' wives. I don't agree with him, but that's okay. But I can't help but wonder, and I taught on this a couple years ago when we looked through this and I reviewed my notes recently, is that Paul doesn't specifically mention pastors' wives because the elder's role is a uniquely spiritual role that the wife may not have, is not supposed to have any leadership in. Because, I mean, I'm sure you've seen it. Pastor and Mrs. Jones or whatever. And you're like, well, wait a second. That's the man who's supposed to be the pastor, not the wife, too. So there's specific things that I don't tell Megan because it's not knowledge for her to know about. Now, some of that conversation in marriage is just bound to happen, but there are certain things that I won't talk to Megan about because they are so sensitive and unique to the role of elder. I think Paul is trying to delineate the difference between a deacon who serves alongside his wife and an elder whose wife is not necessarily part of that ministry team in the same way that a deacon and his wife are ministering. Follow-up questions? You good? Okay. Is there a hand back there? No. Okay. I'll make you ask a question. All right, verse 12. Deacons are to be the husbands. Is that too small? Can you bump up the size? Bump it up 1 notch. Deacons are to be the husbands of one wife, managing their children and their own households competently. Obviously, this is referring to the family life. The family life is not only important to elders in the church, overseers, but to deacons too. Remember, the deacon is a servant, but he's a qualified and gifted servant, a called servant of the church. We're all supposed to serve. Ephesians 4:12, I think it is. Equipping the saints for the work of ministry. That's all of us. But in particular, elders are the ones who are designated by the congregation to serve in this way. And his family life needs to be one that is good and meets the qualifications set by Scripture. How many of you have ever heard the phrase of this phrase right there, husbands of one wife? You've heard of it put this way. He's a one-woman kind of man. Raise your hand if you've ever heard that phrase before. Yeah, that's an excellent phrase. A one-woman kind of man. Because Paul is not talking about men not having more than one wife. Sorry, guys, you can only have one wife. No, that's not what he's saying. He's talking about the quality of a man's marriage, not the quantity of women he is married to. Now, obviously, a man cannot be married to multiple women, and we don't struggle with this here in America, but in other countries, and I know of some men who have been in situations where they've had to counsel pastors in African countries. So-and-so seems to be qualified to be a deacon or an elder, but he's got 2 wives. What do we do? Well, I think the scripture is pretty clear. You can't serve as an elder or a deacon. So it's not talking about the number of times, or even the lack of number of times that he's been married. A man cannot be a deacon if he sleeps around, if he has eyes for other women. He can't flirt with others or have secret emotional relationships, even if they're not sexual oriented. His eyes must be for his heart alone. And this is the same qualification. I won't pull it up, but it's given in Titus 1. An elder must be blameless, the husband of one wife, or faithful to his wife, as the NIV says. In other words, one of the ways that he shows his blamelessness is that he is faithful to his wife. Now, I emphasize this because there are some translations out there, like the NRSV and the CEB. They talk about having only one wife. But that misses the point, because it's not talking about the quantity of wives, it's talking about the quality of the man's marital life. Marital faithfulness. There's other translations that will say something like married only once or never been divorced. That is not communicating clearly what Paul is saying here. Logically, it doesn't make any sense either. I mean, what happens if the man's wife dies? So all of a sudden he has to resign being a deacon because his wife dies? I don't necessarily think that that's the case. Or what if the person has been divorced? This is a little sticky here, I admit, but let's say a man was faithful to his wife for 10, 20, 30 years, and then the wife leaves him, like in 1 Corinthians 7. Can that man serve as a deacon? If he's been celibate since divorce, or remarried, or something like that, then yes. But if his character was rotten in the first place, then no. He has to have character that proved, back when he was married, and even after his marriage ended, that he continues to be a blameless, one-woman kind of man. He's talking about a man who can't be a womanizer, or a man who abandons his wife, has loose morals. No, it can't happen. Now, what about singles, unmarried men? Can they serve as deacons or elders? And I argue yes, because Paul himself, so far as we can tell, was an apostle and was a single man. And again, he's talking about the quality of the person's family life, not the quantity of wives. Because if you start saying it's about quantity, then all of a sudden you say, sorry, you can't serve as a deacon until you get married. You better get your game on. Come on. But if the single man has utmost godliness and holiness, he can be a deacon or an elder, depending on his gifting and calling. All right. Now we go to the end of the verse. So that's the husband and one wife. Now we go to this phrase, managing their children and their own households competently. It's very interesting. Paul describes it this way in Titus 1:6 about an elder. He must be blameless, the husband of one wife, with faithful children. In other words, this is not talking about him having to have children. You don't have to have children. I mean, if you're single, you should have children, for the most part. If you're married, but you have tried to have children, and God has not blessed you with children, that's not a barrier to being a deacon. This isn't a punishment on those who haven't had children, or those who biologically can't. For instance, I was a deacon at our church in South Carolina, and we didn't have any children yet. Or one of the elders at one of our sister churches up in Arbor, he and his wife tried to have children biologically, or not able to biologically, and so they tried to adopt. And I don't know the whole story, but for some reason it didn't work out, and they weren't able to adopt either. So he's been an elder there for 30 years. But if he does have children, if the deacon does have children, and they're old enough to know better, they must be submissive and well-behaved. Because the qualification is not as much about the children themselves as much as it is about a reflection of how he parents and what kind of character he has. He's not just kind of like passive, like, whatever you think, wife. Or he's not like disinterested, like, yeah, I'll get to you next Thursday, kid. I gotta finish my report for whatever. He's not neglectful in raising or even disciplining his children. family situations has to be taken into account, but the big idea is that he is a good father. Now, this is difficult because you can be an extremely godly man and yet have rebellious and even unsaved children. You can even be a perfect man and have men who come around you for years and still one of them can apostatize. Of course, meaning Jesus and Judas. But the overall principle is this. The man has to be so godly that the child is submissive and he is doing his work to make sure that he is disciplining that children and not just letting him run amok. The deacon has to have a good family life. There's no question from an elder or deacon that the person has a good family life because of his leadership and character. I think there are two ditches when it comes to this verse here. The one ditch is you have such a high standard for elders and deacons and their families that no man can be an elder or deacon because they're not good enough. Their children aren't well behaved enough. On the other hand, you have the other ditch, which is that, well, I know George's teenage son goes out to drinking parties on the weekend, but that's all right. He's old enough. And the pastor or the elder deacon will stay in office despite having his child be just out there doing crazy things because it's a reflection upon his character to some extent. And it's a hard balance. So that requires not only the elder's leadership in the process, but also the congregation's input. If I had some of you coming to me and say, hey, I just don't think that George should be an elder or a deacon right now, then that would be a good reminder to us that, okay, maybe it's not the right time for George to be an elder or a deacon. I need to kind of state this outright, that yes, a deacon and elder must discipline his children, but never, ever abuse. This is abhorrent in the sight of God. He may not be manipulative or authoritarian in his leadership of his wife and children. He has to lead them spiritually, talk about family, talk about Christ among his family in the home, lead in the kind of things that he allows his children to partake in. Does the deacon prioritize spiritual things like church and like Bible study and like family Bible time at home? Does he manage his household well? Or here's an example, that word managing their children and their own households competently. Let's say that the potential deacon's wife, is just out there spending gobs of money on... my wife's giving me funny looks back there, so I couldn't help but laugh it out. Gobs of money out there on new furniture and new cars and new snowmobiles and new jet skis and new boats, and the family's floating up to their eyeballs in debt. And the deacon says, well, it wasn't me, it was my wife. I shouldn't be held accountable for that. Oh, yes, you should, because ultimately it is your leadership of the family. Deacons must be men of character, who are, as D.A. Carson said, remarkably unremarkable. They're just good men, good Christian, godly men. That's identical for deacons and elders. Questions on verse 12? Comments? Feedback? Bethany, you got a question this time? No? Okay. Anybody else? Alec?
What about children with behavioral issues? Specifically, there's a defiance disorder that children can have, and then that is a chemical imbalance that would cause them not to submit to their parents.
Yeah. It's tricky. It is tricky. Yeah, it's one of those situations where you got to take it on a case-by-case basis. I mean, if the husband, father, and the wife as well is just letting their kid do whatever, and you're like, but if his bottom got spanked a little bit more, maybe he would do that. I mean, that's not the right time for a man to be an elder. But if he's disciplining well and not abusive, but disciplining carefully and gently and wisely, and the results are just not what you would wish, then there's some prudence there that you can say, this is or may not be right now at the right time. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Ish. Okay. Megan?
Going back to the husband and one wife, part, you said a deacon could be a new convert.
Yes.
So you could have some things in his past
Yeah.
that show that he wasn't. So then how much time do you give him to show
Yeah.
that he is
That's tricky.
now?
Well, it doesn't recommend that a deacon be a new convert. And it just doesn't forbid it like it does with an elder. So I would be pretty loath to let's give me a male name. Give me some male name. Kevin. Okay, Kevin comes in, and he comes into one service, and he's converted right there in the spot. And then 3 months later, I'm like, hey, everybody, we got a new deacon candidate. His name's Kevin. I don't know. I don't think I'd be willing to do that. So I mean, what qualifies as new in convert anyway? I'm not sure the answer to that question. So all I would say is that it depends on the circumstance, and I'm not sure we should discredit a man because he's only been saved a year versus 10, 15, 20 years. There's some personal judgment that needs to happen. Does that answer your question?
Also, the election of the individual to either office, you have the body is doing the voting, and you trust that the Spirit is doing the leading, and that there won't be some unanimity behind raising someone that has serious questions.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I feel like I'm making this a painful process for us all to go through the election of a deacon. I mean, for one, we got the history. I mean, the last deacon we had was Cliff, and he was the only deacon our church ever had for 45 years. And he passed on a few years ago, so we've had nobody. But then I want to be careful. I want to make sure that this is the unanimity, or at least close to unanimity, of the church body, and not just me trying to push my favorite person into an office in the church. To go back to Megan's question about things in the past, yeah, if a person's had a new convert, if a person has been a new convert, then that's going to be tricky because, yeah, he's going to have difficulty in his background. Or he may have difficulty in his background. If he was saved out of a really rough family life or something like that, and I mean, yeah, I can see how there would be some like, oh man, we need to weigh this really carefully. But just it needs to be wisdom that guides us. Things. Other questions, comments? Jenna, do you have your hand up? Okay.
Can I ask something?
Yes, ma'am.
We have a very godly man sitting next to me.
Mm-hmm.
He has all the qualifications according to this, except for in the past. Why can't he be given a second chance? I mean, I'm not saying Peter wants to do that, or anything. I'm just using Peter as an example because so many of the things they can't do are only because he's divorced. I mean, that, since then, you watch Peter and he has all the qualifications. Is there ever a time when you make an exception to these rules?
Two parts to your question. No, there's never an opportunity where you take an exception to these rules. But there is a time when you say, he fits the qualifications, but there are some caveats that we need to carefully work through. So let's remove the situation with Peter, because that just is awkward. Okay. So let's say Kevin. Use our Kevin example.
Okay.
Kevin was married for 30 years, faithful, godly husband, and wife left him, and he's been in our church for all these years. I don't see there's any reason why we can't elect Kevin as a deacon, because even though he is divorced, his qualifications still prove to be the husband of one wife, and he is a one-woman kind of man. And that's different than a lot of churches that you'll come across, even good evangelical churches. They say, if you've been divorced, never again will you be able to serve as an officer. And I say that goes against what Paul is arguing here about the quality of the man's character. Does that answer your question?
Sort of.
Okay. Maybe we can talk later about it. All right, verse 13, and we'll finish up. Those who have served well as deacons acquire a good standing for themselves and great boldness in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. Is he saying that the man merits standing with God, or has more favor with God because he serves well. No. It just seems to be referring to the fact that he earned the respect and the trust of the congregation that he will undoubtedly receive if he serves as a deacon in the long term. Because people will be encouraged by their service, in their service to the Lord because of his service. He's gaining respect that he legitimately deserves. And they are assured in their faith because of his faithful service. Man, I just so admire Deacon Kevin. He never receives a dime for any of the work and effort that he puts into the church, but he's done so faithfully for all these decades. That's the kind of man that you want. He's very selfless. Or something like this, man, I serve because Jesus has served me. What a privilege to serve him, whether as a deacon or just a normal servant in the church, too. The word, by the way, is just served. Most translations, like the ESV and understanding, expand it to serve well as deacons, but really it's just one word. They have served well, but I think it's an understandable extrapolation there, that those who have served well refers to deacons who have served well. And it's just referring to the stand they have with one another, not trying to gain any sort of meritorious work with God. People are going to receive spiritual benefit from the humble service of deacons. Okay. Questions or comments about this verse or any of the verses? I hope it hasn't felt like I've been beating a dead horse. Just trying to be careful. Be serious and faithful, diligent with what God has given us to do. Anybody? All right, let me close in prayer. Then we'll dismiss to figure out food, and we'll reassemble the auditorium here so that we can eat together. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for the gift of deacons to churches. You could have just set it up so that there's no office as deacons, and we all serve, and yet there's an exemplary manner that the deacons serve that helps us to serve you. As we discuss Alex in particular today, I pray that you would give us wisdom, understanding, and even the right timing in electing him as deacon. I pray that your will would be done. Keep us humble before your throne. Not of good that we have done, as the hymn says, in Jesus' name. Amen. Was it actually streaming, Ethan? Okay. Oh, you must have already clicked off of it. Okay, because it said connect on here.
Oh, no, so if you have an app, it's leave it there, but it's still streaming.
Great.